Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Angela, and I am thrilled and excited to have Dr. Bruce Chalmer here today with me. And he is a psychologist in Vermont who has been working with couples for over 30 years. Through his teaching, consulting, writing, podcast, and videos about relationships, his ideas have helped thousands of couples and their therapists. Dr. Chalmer is the author of 3 books, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again, that was published in 2024. And It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong, published in 2022. And Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back, published in 2020. So you've got a consistent record of producing books every couple of years.
Seems like it. I hadn't planned it that way, but yeah, I guess so. I've got another one that's starting to percolate now too, so maybe it'll come out next year.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yep.
So with his wife, educator Judy Alexander, Dr. Chalmer co-hosts the Couples Therapy in 7 Words podcast. And his other notable interests include musical composition, choral singing and directing, and his composition. Oh boy.
Brachot.
Okay, perfect.
That's a Hebrew word, brachot.
Okay, no wonder I can't. Okay. And that was recorded in 2005. And he has served in leadership positions in several Jewish communities in Vermont. So I am so delighted to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. And, we talked just a little bit before this started. There's so many different forms of grief, and often in relationships, it becomes foremost in how we can communicate with each other and how we get through some of the things, the changes that happen. And so I'm anxious to dive more into this because I know that every time I revisit a different type of grief, there's so many parallels to no matter what it is. And so I know that anyone's going to find this helpful. We all have relationships. So, yeah. So well, first of all, before we start that, let's just hear a little bit more about you. Just give us a little bit of background on how you got started doing all of this work.
Yeah, I came by, I'm in my mid 70s now. So, I am officially an old guy. And I've been doing it, as you mentioned, I've been seeing couples for over 30 years. But if you do the math on that, I was already close to 40, actually, before I even started getting the clinical training side of things. I did get my PhD in psychology when I was younger, but it was on the research side, and I didn't get the clinical training until later. And that was a result of just events in my own life that showed me the power of therapy. I went through a marital crisis of my own, and the experiencing what I experienced through that led me. It was really the work I used to do. I was a statistician for a while. I was teaching courses in data communications, doing all these different things that I enjoyed. I was good at it. But this is more of a calling. This feels like, wow, this is something that feels so meaningful to participate with people going through these really hard things, often involving grief of one kind or another. And my own experience of that was what led me into, I experienced therapy. Actually, it was interesting. I experienced some therapy that was really good and some therapy that in hindsight was really bad, but I learned from all of it and decided, wow, I really want to do this. So I got trained in it, did internships and got licensed and all that stuff. And that's what I've been doing. So I've been private practice now for just over 30 years and I'm just loving doing it. That's why I continue to do it, even though I'm an old guy.
Yeah.
Because I keep enjoying it.
Yeah. Well, and isn't that the most amazing thing is that when you find your, say, calling or the thing that you love to do, why not keep doing it? You're helping a
Yeah.
lot of people and it's fulfilling. That's for sure.
Yeah. And most of what I've learned, and I think this would be true for anybody who's been in practice for a long time, most of what I've learned from the people I've worked with. I've learned a lot from colleagues. I've learned a lot from trainings. I'm not taking anything away from that, but mostly I've learned from people who are have granted me that privilege of letting them be part of their lives when they're going through such hard stuff. And it's really inspiring just to see people's heart that they go through some really hard things. And I know this is a podcast about grief. I mean, my God, it's all about going through hard things. But there's something inspiring about accompanying people on that journey, and especially when they're inviting me to be helpful to them if I can. And I find that's really very rewarding.
A work that not everybody would want to step into, that's for sure. But
Mhm.
as I have found, through grief, it was the same thing. The more I asked people about it, the more I heard people's stories, the more I told my own story, the more information I acquired and the better understanding for me and everyone else. Because when you're sharing, that really helps too. And I know you and your wife have that podcast as well. I love what you're doing. So, one of the things that is really jumped out at me with couples and relationships is the whole betrayal piece. There's so many ways that we can betray someone else knowingly or unknowingly. And then how do people get through that, or do they? Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
I'll answer the second one first. Yes, often. They do often get through it, which is amazingly inspiring that people do heal. I guess I'd venture to say most people heal one way or another. I mean, to varying degrees in different ways. But I suppose maybe what I'll do is kind of flesh out a little bit. What do we mean by betrayal, even?
yeah, that would be great.
Because the thing about betrayal, grief, of course, happens when you have a horrible loss, and grief is almost always a part of being betrayed. But the thing about being betrayed is it's a stranger can hurt you. Life can hurt you, but a betrayal only happens from someone with whom you have a relationship that carries some expectations. Betrayal happens when somebody does something that you thought in your relationship with them they could never possibly do. That's what betrayal means. So
Mm.
when somebody, someone in a monogamous relationship goes and has sex with someone else, that's for most folks, that's a betrayal. Or if somebody all of a sudden decides they want out and they never would have thought that their partner would, suddenly desert them that way, that's a betrayal. There's all kinds of ways that people can betray each other. And you mentioned it's interesting. Can people betray each other sort of unknowingly? And the answer to that is yeah, actually they can. And a lot of the work initially with folks sometimes I shouldn't overstate this, but a fair amount of the time, a lot of the work with folks is deciding, were you really betrayed or was this just something that was painful? Because, somebody might feel something is a betrayal, but their partner may feel like, no, I'm disagreeing with you, but I'm not betraying you. You know, I we have a difference we better work through here, but I wouldn't call it a betrayal. So a lot of times that's part of the work. Much more often, I would say, when people come to my office, it's because, and talking about a betrayal, it's pretty unambiguous. Usually the most common one, of course, that I see with couples is infidelity.
Mhm.
That's close to half of the couples I see, I think. I never haven't counted exactly, but it seems to be about close to half of the couples that I see in a first session are dealing with infidelity. And then of the ones who aren't dealing explicitly with infidelity, a lot of them are dealing with some other kind of betrayal. Somebody was keeping secrets from them financially, or somebody was lying to them about other things aside from having sex with someone else. There's all sorts of ways that people can be betrayed. And so the work then becomes the title of that book you mentioned, my most recent book, is Betrayal and Forgiveness: How to
Mhm.
Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. The work is often about, can you get to some sense of forgiveness, which then allows you to figure out, okay, if I can forgive sufficiently, then maybe I can think about trusting again or not. And and I do, and of course, let me pause before I launch into my whole lecture on forgiveness, but it kind of depends on what you mean by forgiveness there, and I have some thoughts about that as well.
Mm. Yeah, and forgiveness is a huge piece in grief. It has been when I've been talking about grief, a loss of a loved one, because we do feel betrayed. They left us.
Yes.
We're here to do all the stuff that they were supposed to do with us. There's always that. And I found a lot of that and really had to work at letting a lot of that go
Yeah.
as part of the healing. Yeah. So, how do people do this?
Well, I talk about three steps to forgiveness. And it's funny, whenever I've talked about this, I have noted anytime you have some seemingly clever author saying, well, there are three steps. Yeah, no, there aren't.
Yeah.
Not that simple. But it's still, I laid it out that way because it's a useful way of thinking about it. I'm not trying to claim that it's just one, two, three, and then you're done.
Right.
That's not how
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
works.
Hmm.
But when I talk about forgiveness, first of all, what I mean by forgiveness and what I don't mean by forgiveness. What I mean by forgiveness is exactly what you were saying when you've had to deal with the loss of a loved one. Letting go of the anger, letting go of the obsession, letting go with that feeling like the past has to be different from what it was.
Hmm.
That's what that means. I forgot, somebody has a wonderful quote about that, which I don't remember at the moment, but it's very much saying that forgiving is about giving up the idea that the past had to have been different from what it was. There's some much more eloquent way of saying it that I don't remember, but it's that idea.
Hmm.
How do you do that? Now let me say what forgiveness isn't the way I'm defining it. Because a lot of times when you're talking about, especially in the notion of betrayal, a lot of times people will say, well, if I forgive this person, am I just saying that it was no big deal? And not at all. If I forgive this person, am I saying that, okay, we can go back to our relationship as it was? Not at all. You can forgive somebody that you don't trust at all. You can forgive somebody you have every intention of divorcing or taking to court or whatever. So it has nothing to do, really, when I talk about forgiveness, it has very little to do with the person you're forgiving. It has everything to do with your internal process. It's somebody in, I think it was a 12-step program, was saying forgiveness is an inside job. It's something you're doing for yourself. Very much like when you've lost a loved one to, let's say, an illness or something like that. It's way complicated when you've lost a loved one to suicide. That becomes incredibly complex.
Hmm.
But to lose a loved one to illness, where from any rational basis, it's like, oh my God, this just happened. You can't blame anybody.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, there's anger to be gone through. To accept reality for what it was is really another way of saying forgiveness. So how do you do that? Well, so three steps. Step one, I claim that inevitably, when something bad happens, partly we blame ourselves. There's always a piece where you have to forgive yourself. How could I not have seen it coming? How could I should have done something to prevent it? Or if it was the case of like a betrayal, like a infidelity or something like that, how could I be so blind as not realize this was happening? How could I have been so stupid? Whatever it is, we beat up on ourselves. And that's a natural thing to do because it's kind of the flip side of wanting to feel like we have some control over what happens.
Hmm.
So when bad things happen, it's like, well, I should have been able to stop it. I've worked with adults who were abused as children, like adults who were sexually abused at the age of 3, who still, not rationally, but emotionally, they still blame themselves for it. They said, I should have stopped it. You couldn't have stopped it. You were 3 years old. That's ridiculous. You know that on a rational basis, but we still blame ourselves. So step one is to forgive yourself. And what that means essentially is to accept deep in your heart and soul and gut that you were doing the best you could, knowing what you knew and not knowing what you didn't know. It's like,
Hmm.
well, if I'd known differently, I would have acted differently, but I couldn't know differently. I only knew what I knew. I
Right.
was who I was. That's that. So that's the process of forgiving yourself. Step two is forgiving whoever hurt you. Now, in the case of infidelity, that's whoever cheated on you, for example. Uh, that one I claim, slightly shaky claim probably, but nevertheless, I claim that's a pretty short step from forgiving yourself. If you can really accept, if I can really accept, well, I was doing the best I could. I wish I'd known better, but I didn't. I can extend that same understanding to whoever hurt me. I can say, I wish they hadn't been thinking that way. I wish they hadn't been angry at me, or I wish they hadn't been feeling the way they were feeling, but apparently they were, and they did things that they knew was wrong and I know was wrong. But sometimes people do wrong things because those are the forces operating on them at that moment. You can extend that forgiveness to them. You can say, well, they were doing the best they could too. Damn, I wish they didn't, but there it is.
Hmm.
The third step, I think, is where this has most in common between all sorts of betrayals and the particular betrayal of losing a loved one. The third step I give a funny name to. I call it forgive God. And you don't even have to be religious to appreciate this, I think. You don't have to be religious in any sort of classical Western religious sense. Forgive God means accepting that we live in a world where that kind of stuff can happen,
Mhm.
where you can lose a loved one and you shouldn't have lost a loved one, but you lose a loved one, where someone can cheat on you and they shouldn't have cheated on you, but they did, where you can accept that we live in a world where we have such control as we have, but it's just not enough to prevent bad things from happening all the time. That's what I mean by forgiving God. There's some acceptance, not only sort of clench your teeth and accept it grudgingly, it's an acceptance that says, no, it's right to be that way. Theologians will argue about that. Well, like, how can a good God let bad things happen to good people? And the classical answer there is free will. We have to be able to have free will. The whole business wouldn't work without free will. If we have free will, then we can do evil as well as good. That's the only reason there's a good, is that we're capable of doing evil.
Mhm.
That's, cold comfort to somebody who's in the middle of experiencing that kind of loss. But that's what I mean by forgiving God. When you can get there, more or less, that's when you can actually then consider, all right, if it's the case of somebody, let's say, who's cheated on you, what do you do about that relationship? If you can get there, I think in the case of grief, the loss of a loved one, that's when you can consider, okay, maybe I can actually find a way of enjoying my life again
Mhm.
in spite of having gone through this loss. Maybe I can even appreciate the beauty of the love that is the flip side of that loss,
Mhm.
because I'm only experiencing this deep pain because of all the love I had for the person. So you can start to have a perspective on that when you get to that state level of forgiveness. And of course, as we all know, that often takes time. That's not an instantaneous process.
Yeah, well, in my own mind, just thinking about it, I knew that there was no reason why I should be angry, right? Or
Mhm.
feel like I was betrayed, and yet I couldn't stop that piece for a while. It took a
Mhm.
while to work through that. And I'm equating forgiveness a little bit with just acceptance. And
Mhm.
it's really sometimes hard to accept when we are in that pain and we can't see ourselves on the other side of that at all. So yeah, I think that forgiveness piece is huge, and working through that, I know for a fact, is not easy.
Yeah. And I can even invoke, I suppose, some neuroscience, and I am not an expert on neuroscience, but I do know in terms of how our brains are very complex, of course. Our brains, psyches, whatever you want to call it, are very complex. And there are parts of us that simply don't have any sense of time whatever. So part of that difficulty accepting when someone is lost is wanting to go back and make it not have happened.
Right.
We think we can go back and make it not have happened. It's that feeling of, I want to wake up from this horrible dream.
Mm-hmm.
And part of us, it takes a while to really understand that, for the news to get through to all of those parts of our psyche is not instantaneous. So you'd think, okay, well, this is horrible and I can be sad, but I can think clearly about what happens next. You can't think clearly when there's a whole part of you that is insisting that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
That takes a while to really to integrate all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of, oh, shall I say, suffering that goes on in that time, in that space. And I know coming through it on the other side and living a joyful and happy life again, I know that it's very possible to do.
Yeah.
But for somebody who's in the middle of it, I know that it's really hard to think that you can move through that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, in a sense, that's what does a therapist offer a couple in a situation where there's been a betrayal in the couple? What the therapist offers, and I think this is a general statement, what therapists offer anybody, the main thing we offer, you can answer that with a lot of different things, but my favorite is the main thing we offer is faith. And really, faith is the same thing as forgiving God in my lexicon. I don't mean religious faith necessarily. I mean that sense of acceptance, that deep sense. It's not merely that you can accept that awful things can happen, but you can even appreciate that the world is better for the fact that stuff like this can happen along with the good stuff. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, I wish it weren't so painful, but it kind of has to be possible to be in this pain. That level of acceptance is how you work through grief. And I think that's also how you work through betrayal.
Right.
It's just not odd that, that it's another element of faith. I start with the assumption that people aren't crazy to be the way they are. Almost all the time. Most people aren't nuts. We're all nuts occasionally. I mean, it depends on how you define it. I don't mean to make fun of serious mental health issues, but
Mhm.
most of the time we're not having psychotic breaks or having manic episodes or something like that that are nuts. Most of the time we're dealing with things that are very human to deal with, even if they're not perfectly rational.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it depends on people's faith, but I find that actually thinking about myself as the human that's here on the earth, and then this spiritual sense of belonging to something bigger than that, and separating the two and knowing that I'm understanding that this happened and there may be a bigger reason that I don't understand, and yet I'm allowing this human part of me to go through this
Yeah.
because it's the experience of the emotions. And I really find now, since Blaine has passed, like the emotions are so much more vibrant. It seemed like I was almost, I will say, living in that mediocre kind of range, like never really,
Well,
really too happy and not too sad, like just kind of in the, and it was a good life. It really was. We had a
mhm.
wonderful life together and we raised our kids. What I've noticed is since then, the lows are low, but the highs are incredible.
Yeah. Isn't that something? Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. One of my favorite little topics that I almost always in the first session with any couple I work with, I give them a little talk about the difference between stability and intimacy. And what you were talking about really fits into that because if you think about it, and they're both important. I call them both needs. Stability is important, but so is intimacy. And I'll define what I mean by intimacy. But stability is just all about keeping it so that we don't feel constantly anxious, keeping it so that things are relatively calm. Not a bad thing to want at all.
right.
And so much of the time we orient ourselves, especially when you do something like get married and have children and build a life together, we orient ourselves towards stability. It's not a weird thing to want, it's an important thing. But in the process of doing that, what I mean by intimacy is when you are the very things you're talking about, when you really feel the lows and the highs and everything in between, when you are present and honest with yourself and each other. And often we will sacrifice intimacy in favor of stability because intimacy is scary sometimes. To
Right.
actually let yourself know how you feel. And I realize we tend to have mixed feelings, but to let yourself know about those mixed feelings, to let yourself say to a partner how you're feeling when you're pretty sure it might be scary for the partner to hear,
Hmm.
we will tend not to do that. So there's nothing like loss, crisis of some kind to alert you to what happens when you've been suppressing intimacy. And so many people, and I've heard this from people who have lost loved ones, and I've heard this from people who have been through marital crises and come out the other side, either together or separate. They will often express gratitude for the process. Never heard anybody say, "Hey, thanks for cheating." Haven't heard that one.
Hmm.
But I have definitely heard people say, thanks for precipitating a crisis that apparently we needed. You shouldn't have done it, shouldn't have cheated. We all understand that. But you were the one who precipitated the crisis. And I guess we didn't realize it, but we were headed for one. And look how much better off we are now. And
Hmm.
I've had people speak about that with grief as well. It's like, wow, this is horrible to have lost a loved one. And yet, I have gained such wisdom from going through it, even though I still wish I hadn't lost the loved one,
Yeah.
that and people will say the same thing when they've healed from abuse. Again, never heard anybody say, "Oh, I'm so glad I was abused because of all I learned." No, nobody's going to say that. But they will say, "Wow, I have benefited from this hard work of recovering. I understand so much more now than I used to, and I'm better at understanding other people than I used to be." And people can be grateful for that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the definition of healing is when
Yeah.
you've moved through that and you can realize what you're grateful for in through that process. Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
I love that. And then what came to mind was like a question around illness. Because with Blaine, I went through 10 months of him with colon cancer, and there was a lot to that, and still is a lot there to deal with as far as the unpredictability of the fact that an illness could come at any time. and me moving into a new relationship and recognizing that it could happen again. Not
Mhm.
saying that it would, but there's
Mhm.
almost like this underlying fear that could happen again. And so I've been grappling with that a little bit. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, if you think about it, that fear you're feeling is because your brain is working properly. Do you
Mm,
know that how have we survived as a species? One
right.
of the things we've evolved. I'll often comment on this when another part of my career, I did a lot of work with folks dealing with PTSD and other kinds of healing from trauma. And I've often noted PTSD is not the workings of a diseased brain at all. It's the workings of a healthy brain. It's what your brain's supposed to do. It's warning you. If you've experienced something horrible and survived it, then anything that reminds you of it is going to make you anxious, not calm. We
Right.
are the descendants of people who panicked too much rather than too little. The ones who panicked too little got eaten by the
Right.
saber-toothed
Yeah.
tiger they didn't pay enough attention to. So that's that fear you have, having been through that pain with someone you love and then getting into another relationship. How could you not, you'd be crazy to not recognize that you are now at risk. You're putting your heart at risk by loving someone.
Hmm.
That is always the case. And I've often noted, and anybody who's lived long enough, I think probably has figured this out. When you have your heart broken, if you thought your heart couldn't be broken, you were wrong in the first place.
Right.
There are people who are lucky enough they'll go through a whole life and not have their heart broken, I guess.
Hmm.
Although even then somebody dies, I mean, it's like I don't know if they suddenly die and they never have a chance to realize they're dying. I don't know, whatever that is. But the
Hmm.
point being, of course, our hearts are subject to being broken. That is the human condition. So
Right.
when you love someone, you are setting yourself up for loss.
Hmm.
So having been through that, of course, you're going to have that fear. It's not crazy.
Hmm.
Now, what is courage? I suppose courage is going ahead and loving anyway,
Right.
knowing perfectly well you're setting yourself up for loss.
Hmm.
I think it's worth it, but easy for me to say. To figure that one out.
Yeah, and I know a lot of widows that just can't even think about it. Like they just won't.
Mhm.
They won't even. And then there's others who are really yearning for that companionship. So it's very different across the map on how people feel after that. It's a very
Oh,
personal
sure.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And both of those stances make sense. I mean, for the person who feels that way, I wouldn't consider either of those wrong or pathological. It's
Right.
like, no, you figure it out. It's perfectly viable for a widow to continue to live her life and not find a partner. And it's perfectly viable for a widow to want to find a partner, and maybe she'll be fortunate enough to find one. So,
Right. Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And, it's, you just don't know what's ahead of you and what choices you will make. And I guess that's the beauty. Like you say, it's the human condition. It's what we get to experience here. It's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. 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 We just have to embrace it. So there's something here about your 7 word formula. What's that
Yes, indeed.
about?
I don't know how many people are seeing this as opposed to hearing it. If they are, do people have the video of this available as well? I don't
Yes.
know. Yeah,
Yeah.
they do. Okay, so I'm for people who are watching the video, I'm holding up our cup. It's a couples therapy in 7 words, and on the back of it is the 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. So if you think about those, my origin story for that goes way back. I said I've been in private practice for 30 years. Early on, sometime in the first 2 or 3 years of that, I was at a consultation group meeting. Some colleagues got together. We would get together periodically and talk about our work. And I don't even remember what we were talking about. We must have been talking about couples therapy, I suppose, because on the way out of the door, one of my colleagues, who happened to be a friend of mine, said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" He realized was a silly question. And yeah, how am I supposed to answer that? But I had actually given it some thought. I'd been talking with my wife about it. I remember I'd been giving it some thought. It's like, what am I really telling people? I suppose what I'm telling people, if you boil it all down, is be kind and don't panic. And because so much of the techniques we learn in helping people through a session is all about keeping the panic level low
Yeah.
so that they can then be kind. And by kind, I don't just mean nice, I mean actually experience kinship, recognize your common kinship. And because that's what keeps a couple wanting to be a couple. They feel
Right.
like, okay, we may have differences, because of course we have differences, but we're kin. And so be kind and don't panic. And then so I started sharing that with folks I was working with. They said, wow, those are really interesting. I get how those fit together, you know? Tell me, how do you not panic? That
Yeah,
was the big one.
that was the
So
question
I
I
thought
was
of
going
it.
to ask.
Yes, that's the big one, right? And I have to recognize my simple formula doesn't really answer that as much as describe something. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. So the words I added to the formula are the last two words, have faith. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Why did I throw in have faith? Well, we were talking earlier. What I mean by faith is that sense of accepting reality as right to be what it is.
Mm,
Again, not necessarily religious faith. I've known religious people who don't seem to manifest that, and I've known non-religious people who do. So it's not perfectly correlated with religion.
right.
There are religious people who find it's a nice. I am religious myself. I'm very active in my Jewish community and find that's my traditions are a great way of expressing that faith. But there's lots of other ways of expressing it as well.
Mm,
So have the reason I say have faith. What I noticed was the couples that would come in who are coming in and saying, "Oh my God, this horrible thing has happened. You know, somebody cheated or whatever. We just want to go back to the way it is." And the person who's cheating is saying, "Yes, I'll never do that again. It's terrible. I should not do that." They're not manifesting faith because they're basically saying, "We want to go back to how it was," which is ignoring the reality that how it was is what got them into their problem. So the couples that come in and say, all right, we're in great pain here. This is really painful, but we got to figure this out because evidently we were set up for this by our life, leading up to it. So we can't go back to how it was. We know that. Those couples are manifesting what I call faith. They are saying this as painful as this is, we're going to have to look at it courageously, as courageously as we can manage and recognize it's meaningful. Yes, you did something wrong, but you're not crazy and you're not evil and you're not stupid. There must be something meaningful about it, even if you shouldn't have done it. And yes, I'm really, really hurt and I'm really, really angry, but I'm going to have to find some way of understanding this and getting hold of myself because it can't be that either one of us is crazy, evil, or stupid. Those are all manifesting faith. The couples that did that were the ones who got through it.
mm,
So when I say be kind, don't panic, and have faith, faith is sort of the antidote to panic. Now, that doesn't tell you, well, how you get faith? What if you haven't got, as if it were some commodity, faith as I'm describing it is not a commodity at all. It's not even a set of knowledges. It's actually a practice. Faith is a deliberate practice. You can deliberately choose to say, I'm going to start with the assumption that life is right to be what it is, even when it's painful. I'm going to start with that assumption, and then I'm going to recognize I can't possibly understand everything. It's like you were saying about, on some God's eye view of the universe. How could you know that it was the wrong thing that your husband died when he did? I mean, it was horrible, but
yeah.
we don't have a God's eye view of the universe.
Mm,
So, maybe he was spared from something worse later. Who the hell knows? I mean, you can just speculate endlessly, but there's no
yeah,
way of knowing.
exactly. Yeah.
But faith would just say, yeah, well, there's a rightness to the whole business. There's unfortunately people get colon cancer, and I wish they didn't, but they do, and there's all kinds of biological reasons why that's true. So it happens. So faith is accepting that, and the couples that could accept that about things, even like infidelity, are the ones who could work through it. Not always together, by the way. They didn't always mean they decided to stay together, but they could get to that place of forgiveness, so they could then make decisions that aren't driven by panic. So that's the seven words. And as I mentioned, my wife and I do a podcast and we called it that because that first book you mentioned, the one Reigniting the Spark,
Hmm.
came out. I'll give you the exact date. It was February 29th of 2020. It was Leap Day. We thought that was kind of cute. The publisher thought, oh, let's release it on Leap Day. If you remember February 29th of 2020, guess what happened? A
Oh,
pandemic happened. It was like within a couple of weeks of that all of a sudden everything was shut down. So we couldn't do any book promotion events in person. So we decided we would do a Facebook Live book launch. And we did that and had so much fun doing it. And people said, "Oh, you guys should do a podcast because you're really." What people tell us about our podcast is they see the chemistry. We obviously enjoy each other and we enjoy what we're doing. And so that's what we do. So we've been doing the podcast ever since. But we based it on that 7-word formula that first book was really organized around that 7-word formula. I think the book that is my next book is actually, I believe the working title is going to be Kind, Don't Panic, and Have Faith.
Mm,
That I think that's going to be the actual title of the book. I'm not sure yet, but that's
wow.
I think where I'm headed.
Yeah. So what advice would you give someone who's in panic mode right now? They're not sleeping at night. They're just
Yes.
worried. They're just sick and they're spiraling, can't get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, what advice do I have? I mean, try and find people who will give you the right kind of help, which is really not much more than empathy at that point.
Mm,
Who will be there with you and not insist you be somewhere else. That's the sort of thing. So if you can reach out to friends that can do that for you are lovely to have,
mm,
Therapists that can do that for you are lovely to have. Not all friends or all therapists do that.
right.
But, especially folks who will tell you what you should be doing rather than what you're doing, it usually doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
So you just need to realize you're not alone. You're not alone in how you feel. Something that someone who is embodying that faith that says you will get through this. It won't feel like this all the time. It's horrible now. It's understandable. It's horrible now. You will get through it. Just somebody who can hold that for you before you can hold it yourself.
Right.
So you need that kind of people around you.
Yeah, I love that because I think the tendency for a lot of us growing up, you just seen it as weak to have to reach out for help.
Yeah.
And I know myself, I thought maybe if I just went in the bedroom and just took some time for myself, I'd be fine, right?
Yeah. And there's a place for some of that,
Yeah,
right? For
there's
some
a
of that.
balance of,
Yeah.
yeah, for
Sure.
sure. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
found out, it couldn't all be that. And I found out early on because I felt the support of the people around me when we were doing the celebration of life, and I didn't realize how important that was. I just,
Isn't that something?
yeah, it just didn't,
Yeah.
I didn't compute it
Yeah.
until that happened, and then I felt that and I thought, ooh, no, I think, yeah, the people around you are the ones that, like you say, are holding that for you because it's pretty heavy at the beginning, that's for sure.
And I'll put in a word for something else that occurs to me, which is oddly enough, having obligations that you have to
Mm,
carry forward with actually helps you get through it.
yeah,
And what you end up having to do, and we've all experienced this, if anybody who's ever experienced grief on any level has probably experienced this, you have to figure out how to give grief its due without letting it completely take over. So if, people who have a loss and they're taking care of kids have to keep taking care of kids. People who have a loss and they have to keep earning a living have to keep earning a living. And, that phenomenon, which I'm remembering from various times in my life where I had to I'd be teaching a class. I had to teach the class. I would teach the class. I would get through it. I would go back to my room and cry, but I wouldn't be crying all day and I wouldn't be crying while I was teaching the class. And that's what I would do. You get
mhm,
through it however you can, but there's something about those obligations that actually helps you. It takes you outside of yourself. So it
right,
can carry you forward. It's like it's the bridge that says, well, I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but I know I have to somehow, even if it feels bad.
right.
And that helps you get through. So I'm a fan of obligation in that sense. It gets a bad name in therapy circles, but it's like, no, sometimes doing things because you feel like you have to is more important than doing things because you want to.
Yeah. It's almost the kick in the butt that you need to get you
Yeah.
going. And yet, I'm very mindful of the fact that because I was a doer, it was like if I keep doing, then I won't have to sit with this emotion that's coming up, right? And so I'm very aware
Yeah.
that I needed that time as well. But I did find a lot of help in just being the doer. Like I had this to do
Yes.
and I had that to do and I had to get these things ready. And even though I was retired, I built things that I had to do, right? So,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And it's interesting because you also noted you couldn't, that didn't banish it. You know what I mean? That didn't banish the times where you had to
yeah,
be in your room and cry or whatever you're doing.
yeah,
That it's going to take what it needs. Grief is there for good reason too.
yeah,
Grief exists for all kinds of important reasons in how we've evolved as a species. We need to feel it, and you can't cheat it of its due, but you also want to find a way of working the deal so that you can still continue to exist in the meantime. And that's how we all get through it. That's how people do it. And
Yeah.
the danger, it's interesting. I remember reading research, oh, this is probably 15 or 20 years ago, so I don't know if it's still current, but somebody did some research on grief support groups and what they, which sounds like a good idea. And
Mhm.
what they found was people in grief support groups were worse off than people who didn't do grief support groups. It's because they just kept them focused on how terrible they should be feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's, to say that is not to say, oh, you should just be in denial and never feel it. No, you're going to have to feel it,
Mhm.
but you need to find a balance. And that's so much of life. You need to find a balance. It's like, well, you're in pain, but you also need to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, and that's the reason why the podcast, that's the reason why the book, because I don't want people to get stuck in that space. And I have a sport group as well, but it's very geared towards what resources can we access?
Yes.
How are we moving forward? We certainly acknowledge each other's grief and what we're going through, but also offering what works for us and helps us move
Yeah.
forward, which I think is really important because, yeah, you can get stuck.
I remember years and years ago, this is a long time, decades ago. I lived in a very small community in Vermont, very small Jewish community, well, small community and very small Jewish community. And I was one of the few people who knew how to lead services. So I wasn't pretending to be a rabbi, but it's like I'm not a rabbi, but I can play one on television, that sort of thing.
Mm.
So I was there in a quasi spiritual leader role. And I remember a friend of mine had lost her daughter, tragically lost her daughter at the age of 4. And it had been probably 10 or 15 years before. And
Mm.
she was still, I don't know if you're familiar with Jewish mourning customs, but she was still saying Kaddish. And saying Kaddish is what you do during the first 30 days of the loss, or if in the case of parents, it's almost the first year, first 11 months. But it's prescribed in tradition that isn't forever. And
Right.
that's important that it's prescribed that it isn't forever. It's like, no, you absolutely have to give it its due, but its due is limited.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean you don't feel it. Nobody's pretending that, oh, you don't get to feel sad when you think about it. Of course you do. But there's limits placed on it. There are generous limits, but there are limits placed on it so that you don't let it take over. And I
Mhm.
remember having that conversation that, gee, there she was 10 years later, still saying Kaddish. I don't mean to be judgmental of that because she was doing fine, really, in so many ways. But it was just interesting that a lot of times people will get stuck there and I think every culture's traditions around grief and mourning does tend to suggest that there are some limits. Of course, what happens in modern, at least in American culture, I don't know how it is in Canada these days, but there is so little given. There's so little time
Yeah.
given to
Yeah.
grief
Yeah.
that somebody losing God forbid, a child, especially God forbid, a child or a spouse or parents or whatever, there's so little given to it that I think it sort of errs on the other side. It's like there's not enough time there. Do you expect somebody to take a day or two off for a funeral and then be back in the swing of things when they've just lost a child? Oh my God. It just seems inhumane.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's all about moderation, isn't it? It's in everything.
Yes,
The pendulum
indeed.
swings one way and the other way, and some way we need to remain in the balance. And yeah, but it's really been enlightening to talk to you about all of this stuff. Tell people how they can find your podcast and your books and all of that.
Well, the title of the podcast is Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And so they can search for that on any of the podcast platforms, or they can go to my website, which is brucechalmer.com. And that's how they can find information about my practice, about my books, about also there's a tab there that'll take you to the podcast website as well. So brucechalmer.com is probably the easiest way to find stuff about me.
Excellent. Yeah. And is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? Anything we missed?
No, when people will ask me to summarize, I just fall back on the 7 word formula because it seems to summarize it pretty well. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And obviously, that requires thought and explanation and how everybody implements those ideas. But I find they're very useful ideas to sort of summarize things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you again for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. And I know there's lots more we could delve into, so maybe there'll have to be a part two, but
I would be delighted. Thank you for having me on. Much
yeah,
appreciated.
for sure. And thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and bye for now.